I'll stand up. Hello, everybody. I think we might get going because we've got quite a full day today. I'm Rachel Fensham, and I'm the Assistant Dean for the Digital Studio for the Faculty of Arts. And as is customary, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whom this university, their land on whom this university sits, and pay our respects to their elders past and present, and welcome anyone here who's attending today. This is a seminar that sort of has various parts throughout the day, but is in a way the culmination of a series of seminars that we've hosted here in the Digital Studio this semester on the question of digital heritage. And today in particular, what we're hoping to focus on is what does this really mean for the sort of future of the sector and careers in the future of this sector? And I thought maybe just to begin, we might just pause for a moment and think, you know, what heritage is and what digital heritage is, and how those things might have shifted what we think heritage is. I myself sat on the City of Yarra first committee for heritage, and we seem to spend an awful lot of time arguing about which buildings should be conserved or not in the neighbourhood. And I felt really sorry for the council, who seemed to endlessly be sidetracked by, you know, the debate about, you know, the Victorian building as opposed to the factory building, or, you know, the multicultural centre as opposed to the street art. But it seems to me those kind of debates are really pushed into a different realm. You know, if you think heritage, let's say, is what do we value about the past, and maybe what do we value about the present that will have some future legacy, something that lasts into the future. They're very important questions, and certainly questions to do with place and belonging, national identity, local cultural identities, all of those kind of very complex things that the humanities is so good at thinking about. But as soon as you put the digital onto it, the digital heritage, it seems to me to suggest that there's a whole range of other artefacts, practices that also become of value in the present and of the past, but into the future. And so the very nature of what it is that we value in the realm that the digital is producing, our senses of identity, our senses of place, our senses of belonging, our senses of experiment, our sense of creativity, you know, raises new questions about how we collect, store, think about, and also challenge ourselves via this new digital environment. And so it's not just, it seems to me, the question of valuing what we value, but it's also the ways in which people will access that material, as many of us are now aware. You know, so it's not that I'm going to walk down the city and say, gee, I love that brown and gold paint or green heritage colour on that architectural building, you know, that 80s idea that it had to kind of replicate a fake version of the past. I think we're in a very different space where what is heritage is up for grabs. The things we're making of the moment now will be heritage in the future. And then the questions of ownership and control and management and access become very pertinent. So that's just a few opening remarks from me. We have here, for this very first panel, what we're calling our industry panel. And I'm really delighted to welcome three people who've really in their lives made a huge contribution to institutions that are involved in thinking about the question of digital heritage. So I have here on my right, Seb Chan, who's the Chief Experience Officer for ACMI. Prior to this, he led the digital renewal and transformation of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York for 4 or 5 years. He also drove the Powerhouse Museum's pioneering work in open access, mass collaboration, and digital experience during the 2000s. He's worked as a museum consultant with institutions across North America, Europe, and Asia, and he was a member of the Australian Government's Gov 2.0 task force. At the end is Daniel Wilksch, Manager of Digital Projects for the Public Records Office in Victoria. He manages their digitisation program, which must be massive, you can only imagine. He began working with PROV, which is the Public Records Office Victoria, on the local history grants program whilst finishing off his own Masters in History. Since then, he's had a number of roles within the organisation, focusing on digital access to records, including putting together online exhibitions and most recently supporting the development of PROV's new integrated search engine. In the middle, I have Tim Sullivan, currently a digital GLAM consultant working with AARNet, which is the National Research Network. His role is to be a consultant connecting with the GLAM sector. He was formerly the head of the National Collections at the Australian War Memorial, and before that he was the Deputy CEO and the Museums Director at Sovereign Hill, and has more than 25 years of experience in the museum sector. So thank you. The panel, the format we've got today is going to be a little bit like Q&A. I have some questions for them to get the discussion going, and then we'll open it to the floor. So my first question is, I guess, reflecting on your current position and how you arrived at the GLAM or digital heritage field, what were the qualifications you felt you needed to have to understand your current role in that field? Were they formal qualifications? Were they on-the-job training? I've said even nerdy curiosity could be part of it. Maybe through travel and exposure to other kinds of practices. Were they friends that were stimulating? Was it just experimentation? What were the things that kind of gave you the skills and interest in working in this sector? So we go with you, Daniel.
I was somebody who fell into the sector, more or less. It's probably, if you start working at an institution, it's you don't say no when somebody says this needs doing, and finding the value in whatever that might be. I don't have any formal qualifications in IT. I've spent the last 10 years picking up enough skills around programming and data management and computer program management to get the sort of things we wanted to get done. I've also spent a lot of that time talking to community history groups. I started my archives career as handing out money to people who want to do history projects, and that sort of led to translating what people wanted to do into what they could do with the resources that they had, which was often not very much. So I'm very much DIY end of, if you like, the IT world. I think you do have to have an attention to detail is really useful, especially if you've got a large collection, and like there's all of the big glamorous things you can do with computers, the projections on the walls and the 3D modeling and everything. But a lot of it comes back to transcribing a few thousand names and making sure that you've got the spelling right. So it's being able to find satisfaction in doing both of those, and spending the time on it properly. Yeah.
Great. I'll go to Tim.
Well, all of those things that you mentioned apply to me. My nerdy friend was Seb. And I remember when I was working at the Australian Museum, I heard about this guy, Seb Chan, doing some wonderful things with the web, which I didn't fully understand. And when I found out about it, just switched me on to a whole new world, really. My background is I studied history at Sydney University, and with a projected pathway of becoming a teacher, which would have been a horrible mistake. And there was a mining boom on at the time, and so I followed the other side of my personality, which was around science. And so history and science to me have always been very, very closely mingled together. When the opportunity came up to work at the Australian Museum, it was just like, well, this is just heaven. You've got surrounded by people who are deeply enmeshed in the or immersed in the humanities, but also with fantastic natural history and science potential, and being able to tell all of those stories, and the interdisciplinary nature of it was just absolutely heaven for me. So I love museums. I love working in museums. I don't have any formal qualifications in the digital transformation at all, but as you said, 25 years working with collections and in public programming, and very quickly I kind of found myself in roles of managing those kinds of functions with a whole lot of expert people who knew far more than I would ever know. So there was no point in me trying to know what they knew, but rather trying to become a better manager of people. And I guess that's where when I finished up at the Australian War Memorial, that was the next opportunity for me was to AARNet presented an opportunity to have a look at the ways in which the galleries, libraries and archives and museums might be more closely enmeshed or engaged with the research network that is so strong in universities, and that instantly appealed to me.
Great.
Yeah, similar to Daniel and Tim, I don't have any formal training in IT. I actually trained as a social worker. I really studied social policy at University of New South Wales. But parallel to that, I was heavily involved in the music scene in Sydney. And, I think out of that, running festivals and putting on events and running a club for a decade, running a music magazine, doing public radio, all of those sort of things. What was interesting about that, combined with, I guess, a research practice around sociology and cultural studies and subcultural research, was a building in the 90s of a really strong network sociality. So really using the web and using the nascent internet of the 90s, along with practical, I guess, club sociality, to build a network of professional contact and a way of communicating and telling stories with people. That when I found myself at the Powerhouse Museum at the end of the 90s, I had technical skills. I had a network of people I could connect with that was increasingly global. I had a stable private life. I didn't have to care for ill parents or all of these other things that get in the way and make it hard for diversity in our sector. And I've learned from, I guess, the early days of the web was just enough proof is enough if you've got a good story. And I think much like Daniel was saying, doing things so you can show what is possible rather than doing them completely was really critical in building a practice that's been around innovation and experimentation, but that isn't about building the perfect thing. It's about building the scaffolding that allows other people to build things from there. And I guess from there, it's been about the networks that have been increasingly global for me, and again, using the stability, the privilege of stability in the rest of my life to travel and to work overseas and do all of those things. But it is important to recognise that luxury is a luxury, and it's has been the result of a lot of luck. And I'm not sure that carries forward with the current generations. I think that's something that is increasingly hard, and it's quite uncomfortable to be saying that. I think perhaps the generation that grew up in the 90s when the public sector still had opportunities for, in quotes, careers, that's probably the final generation that stability is there for in a working sense, which I think is deeply problematic for our sector.
Great. Problems on the table. We'll come back to that. But also, I think that idea between the, not necessarily showing what's possible rather than creating the perfect thing, I think is something we might also come back to. This next question is to try and, in a way, pick a little bit up on that last point, which is, where is the sector at now? And one of the things I often say in the digital humanities is we've gone beyond needing just to collect and preserve. You know, we've moved, I think, with the social media revolution into new questions about access, but also I think new kind of ethical questions about the ways in which people might be immersed, if you like, in the digital, and the extent to which we want complete immersion, total immersion, or maybe some kind of degrees of detachment and other sorts of things to rub up against it. So, you know, I guess I'm asking you really then to think about, you know, maybe very briefly, sort of how the sector has shifted in the last 5 years, I would say quite dramatically. And then what are the kind of key issues that face the sector right now, do you think? The next sort of, if you could maybe say 3 issues each or something like that. Let's start with you, Tim.
Well, for a long time, the issue of relevance has been dominant in the sector, and particularly in museums, which I know better, and art galleries. But I think even that's changed. So relevance is still absolutely crucial, but there are so many more dimensions to relevance now than there were 20, 25 years ago. And that's primarily because of the digital environment in which we all work. There are so many people who are now creating their own communities of practice, who are looking to the civic institutions, the cultural institutions, to provide them with the information that they need, the stimulation they need, the experience, the knowledge. At some point it's the data, so they're interested in what we have as data, and they will make their own information. So we have a challenge in understanding the multiplicity of all of those potential audiences and how we connect with them, and also what we provide for them. I hope that that will also change the way in which the institutions work in themselves, because I have said to us, just saying to Seb and Daniel before we started, that I often feel that we are using digital technologies to do analogue things. And this is where you guys are so important. We need another generation of leadership, new thinking, to start using digital technology for all that it can be. And I just feel at the moment that, you know, I've been a part of that leadership in institutions as well. I know how hard it is to be innovative, and particularly in a sector where there is so little or no capital for research and development. That has to come from relationships with others, which is why the role I have with AARNet now is looking very closely at the infrastructure that's been created through the universities as a way in which the GLAMs might be able to expand their reach and their influence and relevance as well. But it does need people who are prepared to think differently. It does need leadership which responds to people who are thinking differently, and that is the most significant thing and the most difficult thing, is that museums are social institutions, and people are always difficult, and change is always difficult. So we just have to find ways of managing change more effectively, perhaps, than we have done in the past. Technology is not the solution. Technology is a tool to solve human problems. And so those things that have always been consistent with the GLAMs about telling the wonderful stories of the human experience are still what we have to do. Technology is another way of doing that.
Okay, which way do you want to go? Go that way. Yep.
Just to amplify one of those points a bit, for an institution like that, where it says it all, like we've known for a lot longer than 5 years that sort of digital heritage isn't an option or a special project anymore, but a lot of our structures and our cultures are still catching up with that. It's less true than it was 5 years ago that, you know, the people who are doing the website and the IT stuff were actually intensely frustrated with the rest of the organisation. Everybody's on board now, but you still have to steer the ship in the right direction. And coming back to that people thing, one of the, if you're able to have enough perspective on what you're trying to do with your website and data structures and the speed with which you can get stuff done with software, and just build that into a workflow as an example, that actually that stuff is usually accepted, and people actually come and work with you around that these days, I think. But it's still there's a risk framework around, you know, IT purchasing. You'll hear words like capital expenditure and operational expenditure. So what we do is immensely constrained by the kinds of funding we get, how often we get it, and what we get it for. And it's learning to work with that the wider network that most institutions live in.
Seb.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the relevance piece is absolutely critical here, and I think that ties into the funding challenges that the sector has, and that sort of social contract that institutions like libraries, museums, archives have with their societies, and how we fund those. And I think one of the things that's really digital has two sides in this space. One is the business side, which just moves on anyway. Everything's becoming digital on the business side of museums. All our in-house systems, all our processes, those are all going digital, and there's no debate around that. But that is also sucking up a lot of the money and the energy that could also be put towards the other side of how digital is transforming the sort of things we collect, the sort of things we should collect and preserve, the sort of ways we communicate with our publics. That side is now being slightly drained by the other side as people realise, oh, right, our record system has to change. The finance system has to go through another evolution. We have to move everything out to the cloud or whatever else is beyond that. Our website has to now also be mobile apps or not. And there's all these other things that suck up in energy, I think, away from potentially where the most exciting stuff is where the heritage itself is becoming digital, and we're totally ill prepared for that. I mean, we're seeing in my space now as the National Museum of Film, TV and Video Games, even in terms of film and television, if we're to collect an Australian production that's been commissioned by Netflix or Amazon, there isn't a print, there isn't a physical print. This is already a file. Or if you think about the Soda Jerk commission that we presented recently, that was assembled in Final Cut Pro and Premiere. When we acquire that work to our collection, do we acquire and preserve it as a single channel digital video work, or should we also acquire the software files that were made to create that work, which allows it to be interpreted in new ways, and its design process revealed in the future? So that sort of side's important too. But that social contract with our communities about what our organisations are for and who they are for is really at the heart of a lot of this. And I think the other thing is we're being visited a lot. Like, museums and libraries are hugely popular now. The end kind of GV, it gets more than 2.5 million people a year. It's crazy. We get 1.5 million. But what is that? We've become part of, as we always were, but we're now a really important part of the leisure economy, the tourist economy, and we need to assert to government our relevance beyond that. We need to be more than a tourist attraction. Otherwise, the other side of our work is not well resourced.
Great. Maybe before we leave that, I think another part of this question I had was really, to what extent you see yourselves positioned in a local economy, a local matrix of activity, i.e. Victoria, or regionally, within a national economy of cultural institutions, or even within a global, and how does that sort of also impact on what you think's going on in the sector in this space? Maybe start with you.
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a shift in the last few years, as it seems globally, a retreat from globalism. And I think it's been interesting to see how the sector, particularly people working in the digital heritage space, have responded to that. I think there's been a lot of pullback from national and global initiatives, and I think it's really hard, and it's unfortunate that shift away from global, because the global is absolutely critical. We need to connect our collections up. We need to connect our stories up. 50% of our visitation to my museum is tourists, local or international. 22% of them are global. A large proportion of them are Chinese tourists. Mm-hmm. What can we do to extend their engagement with us beyond them coming in and seeing some local stories? Can we present some things about Chinese video games? Can we talk about, can we do an exhibit about Chinese social media and art? These are the sort of things we may need and want to do, but it's difficult. That I think there's been a general retreat from that, as we're seeing in politics too.
Yeah.
I think the sector is doing better, and again, particularly with my experience in museums and galleries, that we are doing some world-class things in research and in programming, and for instance, the National Museum of Australia's in developing its relationship with the British Museum has brought stuff to this country we never thought would come. National Gallery of Victoria is doing likewise. Museum Victoria is doing likewise. So we funding for the state institutions is one of those things that drives you towards parochialism, and always has. It's been really, really difficult to shake out of that, because political cycles do make a difference in the way in which leadership has to think about positioning its next stages of development, which is really unfortunate, but it's a fact of life in a federation as complex as ours. But I think we are getting better. I think that governments now are expecting that in a connected world, it is no longer acceptable for Victoria or for New South Wales or the Queensland Museum network to focus only on its own backyard. If you can't create something that's world-class, then why should we fund you at all? And so governments, I think, are getting tougher at that as well as they wake up to it. And Seb made a very good point. The retreat from globalism at the moment is just so deeply troubling. In my most recent experience, having come out of 5 years at the Australian War Memorial, talking about the impact of the First World War, and what are we talking about? A retreat from globalism in this time. It's just extraordinary. So I think it is absolutely imperative that the institutions, as well collaborations with the universities are so important, are thinking internationally, are thinking globally, are thinking world-class, and not just good enough. I know, Seb, you didn't mean that when proof of concept, good enough is the first step, and that's fine. But accepting something other than world-class is no longer good enough, because our peers are no longer within our own federation. It's the globe.
At the same time, you don't have to compete. You do. Some of this is about finding what it is, what your niche is, if you like. Our comparison is actually Ancestry, the website. So, and then if you want to talk about joined up digital, like, people are fiercely interested in comparing themselves to other people. So Facebook's another one, and that has basically led to an immense sharing of data and consolidation and so on very narrow lines. But the cultural institutions are a long way behind that, just in terms of bringing us together. And we share stuff with Ancestry, and it gets like way more visitation there than it does for our own site. But at the same time, people visit Ancestry for a particular purpose, and we've never had any trouble seeing that people visit us for a slightly different purpose, which is often around about authenticity and beyond just pure collecting of names and that sort of thing. So it's about understanding how what you do talks to those other things.
And it's the object thing as well, isn't it? It's the document that people want to see, touch.
Okay, great. Now we're going to sort of move in on this question of the workforce a little bit more. And earlier this year, there was a big report from Access Economics looking at the future of the IT sector in Australia. And they've basically identified that there's going to be a chronic shortage in the next 5 years of IT professionals. Now, none of you have said you've got IT professional backgrounds, but I think you've got one. But I think this moment where IT meets the cultural sector or the historians or, the social scientists is one that we in the university, in terms of the Digital Studio, thinking a lot about. But how do we kind of get the best out of this kind of, growth in artificial intelligence, blockchain, various kinds of data science, cyber intelligence, all that kind of thing, into our sector in ways that, make meaningful work for people. So I guess this next question is, like, as these kind of big data questions accumulate, I think, around security and access, what does it mean about the primary skills we require of graduates in this next generation. And the second part is, what do you think the role of institutions such as Melbourne or any other great academic institution might play in helping secure this workforce for these new kind of challenges? Where shall I start? Why don't I start with you, Tim? We'll go at the other end.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And as you probably picked up from my previous answers, well, particularly when I said I don't think IT is the answer. I think they're tools to solve a fundamentally human problem. We all want to understand the meaning of life on Earth. The collecting institutions have got the artifacts of that human experience and of the natural world. And it is our commitment from those cultural institutions from the time when they were first conceived was about a public focus on learning. They would have talked about education. We talk more about learning now because learning is much more dimensional, perhaps, than talking about education. It immediately in our sector becomes, siloed into school education. It's not that. We've always had a bigger brief, which is about learning in a civic society. So I think the answer is, in many ways, what the Melbourne model is trying to do is to bring the humanities and the arts closer together with other disciplines, which I think is hugely exciting. And that is the pathway to go. So we will never get a better solution to the problems that we have while ever we separate IT people from what we need them to do. They have to understand what we need them to do. When they have a better understanding of what we are trying to do, then perhaps they will come up with better solutions. They'll be able to apply their own creativity in the same way that we expect that we will do it, that they will have a better understanding of the problem. And that again comes back to institutions having a clear understanding of their purpose. And in this, I would say that I'm conservative in that I still believe that the founding purposes, the understandings, the underpinnings of museums and galleries, libraries and archives from their inception is still valid, and we need them more than ever in developing the values of a civic society and the way in which they work. So our institutions have to have that very strong leadership, that very clear vision, and then be adaptable to finding the best ways of doing it. Technology moves so quickly. I was thinking that in a previous life, I worked as a geological cartographer, and I started doing a 1 to 25th hour series map of the Hunter Valley to measure mapping coal measures. And I started on the day that they began sinking the foundations for the Intercontinental Hotel in Sydney, which I could watch out my window. They finished before I did. It took 18 months of hand drawing and photogrammetry, surveying, field inspections, doing all that kind of work to produce a simple 1 to 25th hour map, 18 months. All of that could now be done in about 3 months. So the dimension of change over a very, very short period of time, we'll never keep up with it. It's like, batters in baseball chasing fastballs. You'll never get them. But you have to be flexible and adaptable and understand that the technology, the tools that you have now are not going to be the tools that you will always have into the future. They'll keep developing. So we have to be more adaptable. And I would have to say, the final point is that that will be a real challenge for people coming into the sector, because I think there is a need for a generational change in leadership, in practices, in the ways in which people work together. I think we have to become much more collaborative. The best organisations are those where people work together well, where teams are valued, respected, and work effectively and are supported by leadership. That becomes so much more important in a more adaptive, a more innovative organisational environment.
Okay, we'll go this way and then back to you.
Yeah, I think that last point particularly is super. Something that I think we see a lot in my work now. I've been sitting on executives of museums for the last decade now, and I've really seen this shift towards cross-team skill working and skill sharing, and that's really great. I think the three sort of key things that I look for when we hire people, when I was hiring people at the Smithsonian, now hire people here, and graduates really are this sort of a data literacy. I don't expect people to be data scientists, but I expect them to come out with a knowledge of what data sets can't do as much as what they promise they might do. And that data sort of literacy, I think, is something I expect all employees to have a growing interest in and developing that. Similarly, a good network literacy, that they need to see the opportunities of the network and what that means, and increasingly in my space around experiential design or human-centered design is, and this goes for curators as well. I think it's very hard now to find curators who don't also have an expectation that they will be creating exhibits. Pure research curators seem to have gone, and so curators that are involved with creating experiences for the public, be them physical or digital or blend of the two, is a design literacy. So having some basic design literacies, data literacies, and network literacies, I think are absolutely critical for all graduates to come out of universities with, particularly graduate courses with. And two other things, storytelling skills. So no matter what it is, whether you're creating an exhibit or writing a book or pitching an idea, the storytelling is absolutely critical to get the organisational buy-in. And it's amazing to see the number of people who work in what are effectively storytelling sort of organisations who don't have storytelling skills. The IT manager needs to be able to tell a really good story about why this new finance system is going to change the lives of, I don't know, the finance staff. I mean, storytelling is absolutely critical in a broad sense, and I think people don't. I think collaborative working, both at secondary school and at university, has obviously got a lot better, but those storytelling skills, how to craft a story about what you're doing and why you're doing it, is really, really, really important. Working in the US, it's fascinating to see how many people in the New York museum space, they just have those skills because that verbal presentation is a cultural thing. It's not so much about written storytelling, it's about verbal storytelling.
I mean, I remember even just at the level of the local community, everyone could tell you the story of the post office, or neighbourhoods have stories and they love to tell you.
So our staff need that. I think the staff need to be able to do both the elevator pitch as well as the bigger, more. But also, I think there's a return in the field which is really critical to craft. So people having some craft skills. So having the skills to be more than a project manager. And I think in the last decade, 15 years perhaps, we've seen a lot in the public sector, and this came up in my government transformation work too, that the public sector kind of lost a lot of its deep craft skills, and the public sector, and that includes our museums because they're generally public sector based, had outsourced a lot of the craft. And I think coming into the field with some of your own craft skills, no matter what those are important superpowers and will differentiate you from other people.
I'm hesitant to add anything to that list. Maybe the only other thing, like museums have a culture, libraries have a culture. There's a bunch of IT cultures as well. So there's the open source culture, there's the old school Windows managed services culture. Using the humanities skills to interrogate those cultures, how the people work in them and so on is helpful in getting stuff done. Probably it's good, coming back to that craft thing, both either working individually or collaboratively to try and do an IT development project of some sort, just to understand the rhythms of it, some of the language around agile and waterfall and open source and those sorts of things. Even you could either go down the sort of practitioner route, or you could go down the manager sort of route, but being exposed to that sort of stuff means that you don't have to do a lot of frantic work translating later.
You might hang on to the the mic for the minute. So this next question, I'm sort of, in the series that we've had, I've been sort of reflecting on the series. And so we have had Sally talking wonderfully about Indigenous revitalisation of heritage. So heritage not as a static thing, but something that can also enable revitalisation of culture. We had someone talking about street art and the ephemerality of collecting digital images of street art, and then the problems of data scraping. Once you lose Twitter, URLs, you might not be able to APIs, you might not be able to recover that material, but it happens to be important, iconic Australian street art. So there's those kind of new tensions. There are also, I think, questions now being asked about the kind of repurposing of the content that might be made available online. Remix culture is a big new field, it seems to me, where people want to do more with what we own or what we collect or what we think we have some kind of holdover. So there's a whole range, I think. And the gaming culture that's emergent. It seems to me also raises new questions for the sector about the kind of, maybe also not about just the kind of workers that we need, but maybe the sorts of collaborations that the sector needs. So maybe that's where we might take that. How do you see these, new pressures, if you like, emerging out of digital culture, impacting on the sector? So I'll leave that, start with you, Daniel.
The classic answer is that all of the different kinds of GLAM institution, the boundaries are much more fuzzy between them.
Okay.
It used to be that well, only for about 20 years. This is moving fairly fast itself, but there was very specific professional skills you needed to be an archivist, which was all about managing collections of records. If these days, scale is the overwhelming thing. In my area, there's 1 billion emails probably in the Victorian government every year, and somehow you have to make decisions about whether to keep or chuck them. The old ways of doing that, the old expertise doesn't sort of relate anymore. So one of the things you're looking to across your own sector and joining up to do is saying, well, okay, we can't rely on a distinctive method. Maybe there's a common method of doing all of this sort of stuff. And it's kind of a very narrow answer, but it comes back to that relevance question. As an institutional, most of the institutions started out as explicit gatekeepers, and we can't be that anymore. For all sorts of reasons. So what value are we adding to the stuff that passes through our sort of virtual hands?
The first thing that came to my mind, Rachel, was around the idea of risk, and we have trained people to be very conscious of risk, to be very aware of risk, and to manage and mitigate risk. But I think the risks now are so big that perhaps we don't have a good enough model. I know coming out of Canberra, the kind of things that the institutions are looking at there, and perhaps the War Memorial's experience is relevant, that because it's dealing with some defence type issues, the kind of security systems that were imagined might apply to the memorial were something that for me were quite extraordinary, that we don't really have a lot of classified documents, if any. So it's not an arm of the Department of Defence, but so risk is everywhere, and there's also that sovereign risk of, as you mentioned, about where is Australia's heritage going, how is it being used, where is it being deployed, and for what purpose. But then there's also IP, which is a continual risk. How do artists protect their property, and especially in an area where works are created digitally. Then we think about how then are they used? They come into a collection. What kind of things can we make sure that the data that's associated with them is persistent and protected? How do we preserve that so that those individual, that sovereign risk, if you like, is mitigated? And it then becomes, as Daniel was saying, is a matter of scale. That this is a sector that doesn't have any R&D. Government is great at building buildings, and there's lots of that happening around Australia at the moment, but in this digital realm, the sector is still trying to find its own way of resolving these problems, and perhaps it does need a bit of a game breaker. And thinking with my AARNet hat on, it is probably something that AARNet can do. It provides the spine for the university's research network, which is global also. So, there may be solutions, but we need to think outside of our institution to look at where there are critical partnerships in industry or in universities or infrastructure that already exist that could be better leveraged. And again, we were talking earlier just around the people in the organisations perhaps seeing risk a little bit differently, like putting stuff in the cloud. I spent $1.5 million on spinning disk for storage at the Australian War Memorial in 1 year. I was about to sign off on another $500,000 for more storage because it was growing so quickly. Now, I look back on that with what I've learned since I've been with AARNet, and I think, what an idiot. I mean, what could you do with $2 million in your institution around telling stories? It's crazy. So there need to be some game breakers, and that's something I'm very interested in looking at in the role I have now.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think culturally we have to figure out what the role of these institutions are in a world that is becoming less permanent, obviously with climate change and other issues associated with that. Yeah, I reckon it's kind of going to be a problem, right? Probably sooner than we thought, right? It is already. So this sort of notion of what is permanence and how we might think about keeping things forever versus keeping things whilst they can tell us things and we can make change around them and learn and use them as our societies could and perhaps should. That's probably pretty critical, and that speaks to relevance. And we see in my space coming out of film and TV and games, and before that design, that other organisations, communities are spinning up their own versions of preservation themselves. There are many communities on the web that are dedicated to preserving the things they care about on the web already. What is the role of our institutions? What is the role of a state-supported body, capital S state-supported body, and how is that negotiated, and what does permanence mean? What does that mean in a rapidly deglobalizing world? What does that mean for preservation of cultures that may no longer exist in the next 20 years or 50 years?
Yeah.
What can we do to work with our Pacific neighbours whose societies may disintegrate very rapidly? What is the role in rethinking that so it isn't a new digital colonialism? All of those sorts of things. And I think the First kind of Nations, new engagements around First kind of Nations peoples around the world are really critical in helping us rethink and renegotiate what that means in the digital space. A lot of my work in the 2000s was about opening up access to digitized collections and opening up those freely. And I think looking at that with a First kind of Nations lens, who is giving permission to open those things up openly? Who actually benefits from that? So I think there's a lot of those sort of ethical issues that we need to debate as a sector and with our societies that we represent and are a part of. And that's one of the big changes I've seen in the last 3 to 4 years, which is accelerating even more now, and it's been very, very prevalent in the US sector, of course, as US politics is disintegrated, or the sense of a political consensus is disintegrated. What is the role of the institution in terms of social change? And should it have a position on things? It has a position in any case. Museums are never neutral. Archives are never neutral. But how much do we make a statement about that? And that's something I'm seeing a younger generation of staff insisting museums do, and archives do, and libraries do, which is really great. But structurally and organisationally, we're not well equipped to deal with that pressure. And in the digital space, it feels like that is even more important because we can have impact beyond just what happens in the building.
I mean, sort of one of my own views is that the Indigenous sector in Australia is absolutely leading some of the most important questions for the wider sector, because of those questions around access and ownership, permission, storytelling. All of those kind of things seem to me embedded in the ways in which they're approaching their own cultural heritage at this moment. Yeah.
Could I just say something
Sure.
too, Rachel? Because in 2000, I worked with a team of people who were reviewing Museums Australia's policies for Indigenous and Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's collections in museums, its previous possessions. And at that time, the policies had been operating for about 7 years and had made very, very significant change in the way in which museums had worked. The one thing that had only just started to look over the horizon was what will be the impact of digital technology. Now, this was at a time when there was no smartphone. So that's how quickly the technology has changed. Just last year in Brisbane at the Museum and Galleries conference, a new roadmap is being developed, which is now going to look at these issues of digital technology, because it is such a challenge even for Indigenous people in understanding where does authority come to be able to talk about certain stories and about certain collections and in what context and whose business is it. So it is a really, really significant challenge.
Okay, so I'm aware of time. Maybe just the last question, which was really to come back again to sort of future graduates. And I had sort of two parts to this. One is, how important are mentors and, the kind of role of mentoring within organisations? And then any advice that you would have for graduates who want to work in the cultural digital sector going forward. So why don't I just leave you with the microphone there, Tim, and then we'll go Seb and then maybe
Well, I think
Daniel.
The first thing is that you're in a wonderful environment here. Suck everything you can out of it. Seb has already given a fantastic list of the future skills and current skills, I might say too, that are desperately needed. From my perspective, I love seeing people walk into an interview who have got a broad view. So be curious, be ethical, be ideas driven, without being necessarily ideological. So be open-minded to explore all of the human experience. A broader understanding of history is really, really important. So read, study, view films, see everything that you can that gives you the broadest possible dimension of the human experience, because there is a tendency to narrow the view. We need people who have a broader view. And especially in the new roles in leadership that will emerge over the next generation, that is going to be so important that there is a generous view, a broader view, a world view. And you have to have a domain of knowledge to work in. You cannot just be a specialist in a thing. More is expected than that. I would also say that you have to be resilient, because you will get lots of knocks along the way. And unfortunately, in the past, it's been the case that a research scientist might devote his or her life to a particular species. Once in their lifetime, they might get an exhibition. Now that has to change, and digital technologies will change that. As Seb has said, the opportunities are so much broader and there are so many more. So you need to have those skills of being a storyteller, design thinking, curatorial skills, and understanding how people learn. That's critical. If you want to be able to communicate with people rather than just tell them stuff, you've got to understand how people learn and the context in which they learn. And that's something that museums have become so much better at as well. So I would encourage you, if you're looking at a career in the GLAMs, to get familiar with the literature around audience as well, the people that you are going to be engaging with. I think that's really crucial.
Right, let's go that way. Yeah, Daniel.
Coming back to that craft idea,
craft.
I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, but like the difference between like a professor of history and somebody who's writing a family history for the first time is just time and practice. It's largely the same for, there's usually some ideological work you have to do on yourself along the way and so on. But for IT and for any of those other sets of skills, like you sort of don't walk into uni, get pumped up with them and walked out job ready, much as people might want to pretend like that. It will take time, both while you're here and and beyond that, to get to maybe the place where you'd like to be. I think it's part of that openness and so on is also, and perhaps this is storytelling, is being able to talk to the institution that you're working for or interning with or whatever about, listening to them because they've been here, they've done it before, all of that. But at the same time, it's getting them to give you the time to actually achieve something is sometimes the issue. And so you've got the space to sit down and figure out, well, how does PHP work? How does the internet work, or whatever else it might be?
Maybe you could be Kafka, He was sort of an archivist or something, wasn't he, for years? For years, sort of squirreling away there with the cockroaches.
There's a lovely book by Carolyn Steedman called Dust, which is all about how archivists are so stereotyped. But it's.
But I mean, I guess there's also that sense that, there's this interesting thing between being broad but singular enough to speak truth to power, when you need to sort of say to the institution, this is important, even though you think all of this other stuff is important. Mm.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
I think the higher up the organisation people, the roles are, the more we hire for your network, not necessarily skills. Skills can be learned on the job. What we hire are networks. So your connections with other people, be those communities, other specialists, that sort of thing. So it's very much that sort of notion. I think that growing your network is absolutely critical, and mentoring, as you said, Rachel, is something that me and many other of my colleagues do. Both I'm mentoring a couple of people in the UK at the moment in the performing arts sector, but this sort of notion that the network across sectors and across fields is also a superpower that you can bring into roles. When I was working at the Powerhouse early on in my career, we would basically not hire IT people for IT roles. We would hire people who had a curiosity about IT and had demonstrated creative applications of technology rather than pure narrow skills. So it was that breadth, trying to hire people with a broad curiosity and a network that would support that broad curiosity, however they'd obtain that network. And I think finding those networks is absolutely critical, and there's no better place in university to develop those.
Yeah. Okay, so I've asked my questions. Now it's over to you to ask the panel any questions that you might have. So who'd like to ask the panel a question? Yeah.
Hi, I found that fascinating. I've just joined the University of Melbourne, returning from the UK, where I've been for 20 years. I'm a historian, professor of history. I've just been beautifully undermined. Thank you. But I am interested in what historians and university-based historians and senior academics might bring to enable some of the really interesting collaborations, the really important collaborations, both between IT people and the humanities, but also I think between universities and the GLAM sector to fruition. And one thing that's very striking, I'm sure that humanities scholars across the world feel that they are undervalued and under-resourced. But coming back to Australia, it seems particularly the case. So it would be great to hear your ideas for how we in universities in collaboration with GLAM might make the case both to university bosses who are, of course, see the allure of biomedical sciences, the dollars, the obvious impact that brings, but equally to the funding bodies, to government in particular, who are perhaps a bit quick to say, and I'm not attacking Daniel or his comment, but to say that, what more than anybody can do that, it's just about being interested in reading a book or researching a family history. So, how can we make our case and bring in some support for collaboration with
I should say anybody can do that after they've spent 20 years practicing. one way of putting that is that a lot of what we're using IT to do is not to do the project or the new book or anything. Is to provide the infrastructure for other people to do the book or the project. That differs a lot by institution depending on what you're doing. But we definitely, we kind of discourage our staff from doing a lot of their own research on stuff. It's about organising it so people can use it. So one thing we're really interested in doing is getting students and teachers to tell us what they find interesting about the collection and help us focus our efforts on getting that stuff, digitized or, more available or whatever else it needs to be. And those kind of, the other thing we do, which is not quite germane to your point, but is we have a huge volunteer pool, which is where family historians and so on help is generating lists of all the people who arrived in Australia in from the 1850s through to 1923. This is all volunteer labour to transcribe everything, and so it's thinking about working with the communities that exist around each institution to get stuff done. Yeah.
So I've been involved in a bunch of ARC projects over the years, and ARCs are absolutely critical to what we do.
Yeah.
There was also a CRC that had a model, part of what happened at Powerhouse, with a project called Beta Space. Here in Melbourne, we're setting up a media preservation lab as part of the new Australian Centre for Moving Image, which will be working with Grimwade School of Cultural Materials Preservation. There's huge opportunities, and I would think where there are less opportunities now that were in the past were about ARCs to create an exhibition of the thing. There's less of those now, largely because our gallery spaces are being pressured by other needs, and also that big shift in who comes to museums and libraries and galleries now, and that big push towards a tourism-based leisure economy. So the ARC route towards an exhibition may be less now, but there are more ARC routes that more ARC opportunities around other forms of expressing research, and museums are desperately looking for people to work with on those things. And I think that those create interesting demonstrators to government about the relevance of the humanities and the digital humanities. I was involved in some of the work that Harvard, the Meta Lab was doing in the US, and a lot of my work in the US was working with the universities there around data visualization in the humanities, with humanities data that was held in the Smithsonian and other collections. There's huge opportunities there, and it's about, as Daniel was saying, that the institutions can sometimes provide the infrastructural prototypes, and then the universities have the ability, perhaps with AARNet, to scale those up to a point where they become research infrastructure for other research to build upon. And I think there's huge possibilities there, and it's part of my role at ACMI is as the university's research coordinator, but also as director of collections. So I'm very interested in partnerships there, and I think one of the challenges is aligning the cadence of the museum with the cadence of the universities and the cadence of different research departments and research fields. We work on different time scales, speeds, and budget cycles. We do our budgets for the year before the ARCs even met to approve the project. So those sort of things, figuring out how to work better together is part of making that work. We're lucky with having Meredith here at University of Melbourne, who's been working with my museum a lot on aligning those two cultures. And I would say that the different sizes of museums have more ability to do that. I think the middle and larger size museums are much easier because they have people who they can allocate even a few hours a week to think thinking about that. The smaller ones and the smaller agencies that are increasingly being squeezed, we're going to find that really hard. And I think the big institutions have a responsibility to provide the infrastructure and bring the smaller ones in to help with that.
Yep.
Hi, I'm an oral historian, and I work with Facebook communities, refugees. And I was just coming off of a content lab talk at ABC, and a really interesting question within this kind of relevance and institutional paradigm is that what are you doing to kind of build platform for people? Like I can see Ancestral, there's a lot of stories already. And if you look at YouTube culture, people are sharing their knowledge and ideas. Like there's so many communities already. So what are you doing in your institution to become a platform to facilitate and curate or become like a type of knowledge channel? Because I think that's your relevance now. You're dealing with competition that, platforms where people can do that. So what's the value add from your institution on that?
I think there's an interesting question about whose responsibility is it to be a web archive, particularly on digital platforms, and whether we need, say, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image to archive Australian YouTube. What does Australian YouTube even mean now? Or whether we work with the Internet Archive, Brewster Cole's not-for-profit in the US, who is slurping up that material anyway. Those international partnerships are super important. I think we've seen in the web archiving space, which is generally done by national libraries, that the national borders of that are increasingly less relevant, but perhaps more relevant for research use in the future. If you want to look at, say, the spread of misinformation in WhatsApp in Brazil leading to genocide, you need someone to have archived that in a platform and means to do that. We have some amazing scholars here in Australia researching social media cultures, and I think who should own the platforms that archive the commercial platforms is really an interesting debate. And when I was in the States, I was involved in the national software preservation strategy workshops that the Library of Congress was doing, and even in the US, there was a lot of uncertainty about how software preservation might work in a networked society, and networked software preservation, platform preservation, super challenging. And I don't think that can be done at a national level. That's really at an international level. And I think AARNet is super well placed to be the infrastructure that might connect the NRENs, national research networks in each of the different continents, I guess. That infrastructure, that the universities are perfectly placed as part of that already, a federation of digital archives held across research networks probably is the way, and the institutions like mine may be the presentation outputs of those. I'd love to have an exhibition about what would be a web video exhibition in 1,000 square metre space, like the David Bowie's exhibition. What is that for YouTube? And that's the provocation, I guess, I had asked back to the university community. Let's do an ARC that results in a physical exhibit of what web culture was like in the 10s. And let's do that in 2025. And what do we need to make that possible? And I expect that's probably working with, Facebook in the US, YouTube in the US. Some of my former employees in New York were part of the key team, the core team at Flickr when Flickr started, and they put so many learnings in. And in fact, George Oates, who now works in the UK, George Oates was an Australian who was one of the original Flickr team, who runs a project called Museum in a Box, where she's taken the learning from her time at Flickr to design a portable museum experience that is purely digital that uses 3D printed things from the British Museum and other places to tour around UK schools and communities. So there's lots of cool stuff going on that's influenced by that. But I would say that, you know, an Australian archive of those things may be a bit meaningless because it would always need to be positioned in a global context anyway.
What is AARNet?
AARNet.
Australia's Academic and Research Network.
Gotcha.
So when Sid was talking about NRENs, that's just national research and education networks, and each country has their own, and AARNet runs it for Australia.
Are you saying there's already a federation of digital archives, or there's yet to be?
No,
No, there's
no,
There's a federation of the network that would,
yes.
Federation
for the camera, there's a federation of the network infrastructure to make that possible. Whether AARNet would go the
Yes.
next step and become a digital repository is the question
Or-
that AARNet might already be
Or channel,
exploring.
or even a channel.
Or a channel.
Yeah.
The pipes that connect up the universities, AARNet runs, and that would allow the large scale data transfer, say from a US Federation of Universities to an Australian Federation of Universities for a major research project on YouTube culture, for example.
I would think that Netflix is interested in knowledge channels already, and that's a natural partner.
and they may do it better than us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know,
that's the thing.
it's a little like the last question as well. That it's important to be looking at partnerships, and too often, being museum, we'd be offered an ARC potential or a potential project, and with not enough time to do it, as said, like we need more lead time than that, which is not very good in a fast-moving digital world. But at least in the concept design, it is really important to start talking to the potential partners so that they are aware of it and start factoring it into their own thinking. I think the problem that you've raised is, as I said, it's an international problem. It's not going to be something that will be solved by any one of the institutions because it is bigger than all of us, and there is so much material that's being created that is not necessarily intended to go into a collection. It's being created for a range of other purposes. Where does that sit? And that's a problem that hasn't yet, I don't think it's been resolved anywhere. There's so much of it.
Sue, we'll take your question and then we'll...
From the University of Melbourne Archives. Within the archival profession, there's a lot of debate around this as well, but there's a huge push to get communities themselves to understand how to preserve their own records. Because I think by the time the sort of superstructure of national or international archiving and digital preservation arrives, there will be decades of material lost. So I think that one of the first steps is really about education. It's not about expecting huge institutions to come to the party just yet, although, I mean, there are institutions in Australia which will have a kind of interest in that, as you say, the National Library and the state libraries and so on and so on. But in the meantime, communities do need to take care of their own, and you're absolutely right that the Indigenous people are beginning to do that themselves. In fact, one of the software repositories that people in the Central Lands Council use was actually invented in America. So for Indigenous communities, and it has appropriate permissions and all of that kind of stuff. So it's about people claiming their own as well. And then who knows after that. Sorry, that was a comment, not a question.
Yeah. You want to make a comment?
Hi,
Ruben,
thanks,
yeah.
Thanks everybody, and just following up on this discussion, one of the challenges we've faced as a team of ethnomusicologists and linguists and working with community collaborators in a number of communities in Australia, in different projects, particularly around song and Indigenous song and dance. We had this scenario where we really kind of enrich the archival record through sitting down with old people and discussing the songs and finding the stories and the names of those people and the languages and all that kind of stuff that was never recorded in the first instance. And we've had this kind of technical challenge of how do we feed that back to the archive so that it's actually discoverable again for future generations. I think the software you might mention there is probably Mukurtu that people have been using, but the problem with that is it's not an archive necessarily as well. So it's a curation of materials, and you might find parallels, I think, in the work that's done at ACMI and all these things that you're talking about, where people are really enriching an archive of material. But how do you then get it, kind of feed it back so that people can find that enriched information for themselves? Are there any kind of examples that you know about that you can talk about, or like?
Yeah. It depends a lot. Like, video and story is a technical challenge because the size. But yeah, we're in the middle of building a new repository for digitizing images that will capture the tags or the transcriptions or the the comments that people make and store them together with the images. I don't. We sort of want to be careful about saying that the answer is a big institution, which comes back to that point. But at the same time, there are things that need resources that a particular community who cares about and will do a good job of looking after that stuff can't necessarily do. I suggest one avenue is probably the university, depending on how what you're prepared, what can happen with that material and what can't. It's often a matter of negotiating. Well, for instance, you could give it straight to Ancestry just to produce another example, and they wouldn't take it. But the sort of things that would be happening to that would be commercially useful things for the company involved. And I don't know, putting it on YouTube has probably got similar sorts of problems with that. So that's a long non-answer, but there's definitely other people would recognize the value that you recognize in that material, and so it should be possible to find a reasonably enduring local solution. It's not a matter of keeping it forever, it's keeping it in a good shape to hand on to the next keepers. Yeah,
I'd just say to that too, there's a perfect opportunity where you do engage with IT people who have got a dimension on the problem to be able to talk with you about finding some solutions for it. So maybe that's a perfect case study.
Well, I think it raises the tension between preserving something well forever versus having it usable and useful and available to the people who need it now. And I think that's, in the latter part, you need designers and people who can create great experiences around that so it's useful and usable. And I think that's one of the challenges or the opportunities, is that what we're seeing is that the enterprise systems, for one of the IT word, are generally designed for a very generic use by specialists, and what we're actually wanting is consumer-facing systems designed for non-specialists to use and navigate. And we want those consumer-facing things that are well designed for non-specialist users to also have the permanence and the business models that keep the permanence of the enterprise things. And they're basically not compatible at a structural level, because the funding models for YouTube are not the funding models for your video archive that no one actually uses, that a national library or a national museum has set up. So you've got that sort of, it's really challenging. And I think finding where you sit in that spectrum, and I think it's exactly that point raised earlier around communities learning to preserve their own things for their own use first, and the institutions negotiating a new social contract that clarifies what their role is, and then academic researchers having hooks into perhaps one or both of those with appropriate permissions and ethical considerations. But we're still negotiating. I mean, that's decades of work, I think, which is exciting opportunity.
I'm gonna.
So I just want to ask Seb a question there. Like, is another kind of repository other than one of the GLAMs a likely outcome or possible outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the Internet Archive's done completely outside of the GLAM model has been really interesting and a fascinating provocation. I mean, they're preserving like all sorts of, not preserving, but they're hoovering up huge amounts of what other people would call ephemera and pointless ephemera. But the pointless ephemera becomes useful in volume and scale. I mean, one of the archivists there's been collecting all the demo CD-ROMs off those computer magazines and all those like AOL sign-up discs, digitizing all of that, like preserving all of those, because at scale, they tell you a story about what internet culture was like from 1995 to 1999 in a way that one of them doesn't do. So it's that sort of realizing what the opportunities of scale does to curation. And I think that's the interesting other thing, that curators are starting to come on board with this notion of, yeah, we can't collect everything, but there is a view that we can now get if we can see everything, in quotes, versus just a very small representative sample. There's different things that we can talk about and see, and how do we get the 10,000 foot view and not the low level view, and what are the trade-offs there? Like if researchers could see all of the songs made, I mean, being someone involved in music, there are pirate archives that have every recorded piece of music available. Now, if you know how to get to those, like what kind of .cd or Oink before those were closed down, those were amazing community-generated archives. They're very high-quality music files. There's other projects in the video space which have created archival full-text search of film and television. Now, they're not legal archives, but those offer a 10,000 foot view that Spotify doesn't. So there's some really interesting ethical questions about whose responsibility, who has the responsibility to save all the things. Should we save all the things, or do different societies not care about all the things?
On that question, I'm going to just try to draw this very quickly to a close. We're sort of running into our break time. I guess I started thinking, it was interesting you mentioned ephemera, because I'd already started thinking about that, but something that was amazing in the sort of 18th and 19th century with the formation of societies and the notion of the word society, which we now use to talk about the socius as a whole, but these were sort of societies of interest and societies of profession and societies of, of region, and often saw themselves, I guess, as both the storytellers of a particular specialist knowledge or a kind of an experience that they might have shared. And so I guess maybe we're moving into a new field where the sort of digital heritage is about forming new sorts of societies, rather than actually thinking of them as belonging to institutions or individuals or even, our startup economy or something like that. So that was just a thought I had about that. But I guess things that I might have taken away was the importance of narrative, the shift towards the experience economy, the need we have for some specialists, the role of community, this tension between the scale of preservation and I suppose the agility of, access, points of access. And so those are sort of some of the things, I guess, that I'm taking away from this session. But thank you all very much. It was terrific.